Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on evolution of slavery, some dimensions. This lecture is part of the ongoing series on inequality and difference. I have been discussing with you various forms of inequalities that existed in the past. So we have already discussed Ganikas. Then we also discussed issues related to caste, etc. Today, as I just mentioned, we would be discussing the institution of slavery, how it emerged during the past and how it kept on evolving during different historical periods. The institution of slavery emerged during later Vedic period and it kept on expanding and kept on becoming more complex during various phases up to 12th century AD and thereafter. Several scholars in social science in general and specifically in history have come out with the notion that the slavery along with several other institutions underwent several changes as per the evolutionary process. There are different sources that tell us about various aspects of slavery. For example, several literary and archaeological sources like Samriti Chandrika, Mahabharata, Lekha Paddhati, Likhanavalli, etc. They reveal that the ancient concept of Indian slavery was prevalent with certain changes during early medieval period. The characteristic features of early medieval period, for example, the decline of urbanism, the growing preponderance of a closed agrarian economic structure, the rising number of wars between feudal lords as well as foreign invaders like Arabs, Turks, etc. led to several socio-cultural changes and paved the way for expansion of slavery in India. The significant change in the social scenario of the period was the emergence of vested economic interests on the one hand and the rising trend of the enslavement of people of every varna on the other hand. However, this was different from the earlier times because in the earlier period, specifically during early India, the enslavement of an Arya was strongly condemned. The institution of slavery not only strengthened during the early medieval period and thereafter, but also got accelerated. Now, going back to early India, we can say that association of slaves with agricultural work continued even during the period of second urbanization that was between 600 to 300 BCE. Those who worked on fields were known as Das Karamkaras. While the term Dasa refers to slaves, Karamkara referred to those who were hired to do work. Both slaves and hired workers were important for several agricultural tasks. Then there was Digh Nikaya, which mentions existence of both male and female slaves that were related to several household tasks. Multiple terms came to be used when describing or mentioning slaves of both the sexes. A male slave could be known by terms like Dasavya, Dasabhya, Dasata, Dasatha or Dasabhoga, whereas the female slave came to be known as a Dasi or a Dasiya as well as a Dasika. Several Buddhist texts also mention the institution of slavery and it developed to some extent during Buddhist period as is testified by the literary texts which kind of divided the slaves into three specific categories. These three specific categories were children born of female slave known as Grihajata, then the persons who were imprisoned in war known as Dhwajarata, and then the persons who were purchased on payment of money known as Krita. Now these categories, which earlier were 3, later on increased to 8 during the Mauryan period, as is mentioned in Arthashastra. And then Manusmriti also mentioned that when a woman married a slave, she automatically became the slave of her husband's master. During the Mauryan period, the 8 important categories that have been mentioned in Arthashastra included the 3 earlier categories that have just been mentioned, and in addition to them, there were slaves who were inherited from the father known as Dayagata. Then there was a slave who was presented by some other person known as Labdha. Then there was Atma Vikraya, one who sold himself as a slave, and Ahitaka, one who was mortgaged for loan. And then there were those who were reduced to slavery as a punishment for some grave offense known as Danda Pranita. So the categorization of slaves continued to become more and more complex, and so far as the post-Mauryan period is concerned, 7 types of slaves continued as were depicted in Manusmriti. Now the next major change that came about was during the Gupta and the post-Gupta period, when there was an increase in these categories to almost 15 as testified by Narada Smriti, and hereafter slavery developed into a full-fledged institution with various categories of slaves. The literary sources of the period under study, for example, Vijaneshwara's commentary on Yajnavalkya also referred the identical list of slaves as was referred to by Narada Smriti, and so all this kind of development makes us conclude that the institution of slavery not only continually gained momentum, but it also was kind of expanding in area during successive phases. These wide varieties and wide categories of slaves that were emerging, they kind of belonged to and they also kind of performed different functions. So, for example, the Atma Vikrayi, that is those who sold themselves, served for a stipulated period till the time they were able to fulfill their economic they were able to relieve themselves of the debt. Then those who lapsed from monastic life, they were also kind of described as slaves known as Parvarajatyas. Then there was Upagat, that is those who accepted voluntary slavery, which of course must have been due to poverty. And then there was a category of slaves known as Vada Vaharat, that is those who offered themselves either owing to the to their relationship with a female slave or some other reason. And then there were slaves who just sold themselves off because they were just not able to maintain themselves, again due to poverty, and they were known as Bhakta Dasa. So, several socio-economic and political changes need to be accounted for when one is talking about this evolving institution of slavery. The decay of urban centers, a relative decline of trade and commerce, then distribution of land grants on a very large scale, as well as establishment of landed aristocracy, then the rise of political instability due to ongoing warfare, then a series of foreign invasions by Turks, etc. All these were important contributing factors that shaped the institution of slavery. Then also another very important factor was development of trade relations between Arabs and Turks with India, which played a very important role in increasing the number of the slaves as well as the rising number of their categories, and this again was a continuous process from medieval period onwards. Now, let us discuss various factors that were important contributing factors for expansion of slavery and for a regular supply of slaves. So, a very important factor was wars. The wars have been one of the most important factor for perpetuation of slavery from Vedic times onwards, and it continued to be an important factor during the early medieval period also. So, in addition to foreign invasions, constant warfare amongst the regional rulers as well as the feudal lords in fact contributed a lot in a regular supply of slaves, because most of the war captives were enslaved by the victors, which was the regular practice. For example, after the plundering of places like Mathura and Kannauj, Mahmud of Ghazni captured around 53,000 war captives and enslaved them. After the fall of Kalinjar, Qutbuddin also converted around 50,000 citizens to slaves, and after the defeat of Nidar Bhim of Anhilwada, again 20,000 people were enslaved by Qutbuddin Aibak. So, as all these figures mention, the number of war slaves further increased during several military expeditions in Ganges Doab, when Sultan Mahmud converted 55,000 captives to slavery. So, the defeated soldiers of the enemies were also enslaved and enrolled thereafter in the victor's army. The army raised up with such soldiers was known as Amitra Bala, and they were always placed in the front of the army without being considered trustworthy. So, all such invasions as well as local warfare gave a definite momentum to a steady supply of slave as well as momentum to the trade and ongoing traffic in slave. Then besides wars, another very important factor, a contributing factor, was calamities, both natural as well as man-made, which resulted in deterioration in the economic conditions of poor, and this was a very important factor for the enslavement of the people who had been affected by such calamities. So, they were known as Udaradasas by Kautilya and Bhaktadasas by Manu and Narada, and they kind of surrendered their independence for the sake of maintaining themselves, which they were unable to do otherwise. Then Rajtarangini and Lekha Paddhati, they also mention a number of such natural calamities like famines, epidemics, which forced abundant number of people to opt for slavery for surviving. So, therefore, poverty continued to be a very important factor behind rising slavery, and it was a kind of a last resort for subsistence. The deterioration in economy, the development of self-sufficient closed economy, emerging political anarchy forced a larger number of poor people towards indebtedness, and hence they were forced to sell themselves as slaves. Now, there was a term that was used for such slaves, and that was Atma Vikrai, and they were continuing from the earlier period. Then they were also known by some other terms like Rina Dasa or Akal Bhart. Now, a third very important source of a regular supply of slaves was gift. A gift of slave had a religious sanction also. and this was termed as Labhadhasa by Kautilya. Then several other inscriptions also talk about slaves being given as gift. In addition to several inscriptions, it is also mentioned in texts like Agni Puran, Manasolasa, Mahabharata, etc. It was justified in several religious texts that the donation of female slaves was considered as a pious work which kind of facilitated heaven upon the donor after his death. So, this kind of gave a legitimacy to the institution of slavery, and especially people with affordable economic conditions regularly used to make gift of slaves to their guests, priests and other dignitaries, and so it developed as a custom. The notion of keeping the slaves also had developed into a status symbol, which resulted in a further increase in their number. There are several sources like Lekha Paddhati, Raj Tarangini, and then there is Ruurbela inscription that gives notable examples of sale and purchase of slaves. Then several contemporary travelers have also mentioned about this institution. For example, Ibn Battuta mentioned that how Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, he used to regularly give singing and dancing girls who were slaves of Sultan as gifts to several distinguished amirs or nobles, or to whosoever he wanted to reward for their loyalty. And specifically trained slaves who could sing and dance, who had been trained in these crafts, were gifted, and not any ordinary slaves. Now, coming to some specific tasks that these slaves were supposed to perform. Let us make it very clear in the beginning that they were not only engaged in menial jobs, again several inscriptions as well as the textual tradition, for example the Kalajuri inscriptions, they refer to several kinds of work that the slaves were involved in. Now, specifically coming to the category of female slaves, the household works dealing with kitchen requirements and service to the masters or mistress, including cleaning and other household works, were definitely a part of their job. Then they were also deployed in several other duties like a Sandesh Vahak, a messenger, and a large number of female slaves were available for personal enjoyment of the master as well. Now, while Akbar is said to have prohibited slavery in 1562, yet the practice continued, and we have references to how in 1581 Akbar's very own close counselor Hakim Abul Fath continued to procure slaves, and Abul Fath wrote from the imperial camp to his friend at Fatehpur Sikri, and he kind of he requested him to search for handsome slaves and well trained slaves to serve him and his family. So these kind of references indicate that slavery was an institution that was very difficult to discontinue, even for rulers, even for strong rulers like Akbar. Then women slaves were also given as an act of dowry, and there is a reference to Prince Salim, who was married to the daughter of Raja Bhagwan Das in 1592, and who was given amongst several other gifts, slave girls of India, Abyssinia, then Circassia, as a part of his daughter's dowry. In Bengal and Assam also, the slave girls featured prominently in these kind of gifts pertaining to marriage. Then we have also account of Amir Khusro, who has referred to two types of female slaves, one who were kind of kept for pleasure and enjoyment, and the other category as maidservants, whose main task was to perform domestic works like drawing water or grinding the corn. Then the term for a wedded wife, that was BV, that has also been mentioned, that the wedded wife used to treat the slave girls rather harshly and kept them half starved and always under her watchful eyes. So these are the kind of references which give us an idea of the wider prevalence of these of the institution of slavery. Now coming to the several tasks of female slaves, they are mentioned in the 4 Lekha Paddhati documents, and what one finds out is the heavy burden of work that was put on the shoulders of the slave girls. Now this included cutting, grinding, smearing the floor with cow dung, carrying water, throwing away human excreta, milking the cows, taking care of cattle, and weeding, cutting grass, etc. So the list was endless, and the same slave handling excreta as well as churning the curd could be taken from the same person, which suggests that caste taboos were not so strong and not so visible as far as slavery was concerned. Now besides domestic works, spinning was also to be done by slave girls, and we have references to Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, who despite being poor had a slave girl who helped his mother in spinning. Now another very important category of female slaves was the royal female slaves, who were put to different works. Abdul Razak has mentioned that Devraya II took to himself around 12,000 slaves, of whom 4,000 they used to follow him on foot wherever he went, and the rest were employed in the kitchen or in other palace activities. Then Bernier has also narrated that Roshanara Begum's female slaves, they used to regularly accompany her and brushed away the dust and flies from her. Then we also have account of Pelsart, who mentioned that the rich people had a rule that they had 3 or 4 wives and several slave girls. Pelsart has also mentioned that the Amir freely enjoyed the slave girl, and the wife could not dare to show any sign of resentment. In Rajasthan, slaves were known as Das, Dasi, Gola and Goli, and some slave girls were picked up for company and pleasure by the chiefs, and they also kind of became virtual mistresses of the harem. And it was taken for granted that the maids that a queen brought in her husband's house would kind of never refuse any kind of demand of the king, and women slaves also worked as palanquin bearers in the Mahal. They not only carried the king's wives on their shoulders, but also the king in the interiors of the palace, because the palaces were large and there was space between one building and another. As palanquin bearers, there was specifically the Boi caste, who were Telugus, who were employed as bearers of palanquins and for other domestic services also in South India. And we have references to how the Mughal rulers also were carried on palanquins by women. For example, Shah Jahan, during the annual fair at his court, which lasted for 8 days, used to visit the stalls twice a day, and he was seated on a small throne that was to be carried by several Tartar women who were surrounded by several matrons. So with these kind of wide variety of tasks that were assigned to them, one definitely can gain an idea of how much exploitation these slave girls must be going through. Thank you.